For more than a year now, we have been documenting how the Democrats, working in tandem with far-left smear squads, have set about to stifle conservative speech. Now, these folks think of themselves as rough-and-tumble kind of football players, but they're ultimately blinded by the bright lights. Through campaigns of faux outrage that's stoked on social media, they whip up their frenzied followers, and then that justifies their trampling on the free speech rights of others. Everybody's all upset. But they've never tried their little charade on someone like Candace Owens before. She entered their holy ground, a Judiciary Committee hearing convened by Democrats. The topic? Hate crimes and the rise of white nationalism.
I received word on my way in that many of the journalists were confused as to why I was invited, and none of them knew that I myself was the victim of a hate crime when I was in high school. White supremacy, racism, white nationalism, words that once held real meaning, have now become nothing more than election strategies. Every 4 years, the black community is offered handouts and fear. Handouts and fear. The ancestry of black Americans is being insulted every single day. I will not pretend to be a victim in this country, and I know that that makes many people on the left uncomfortable.
Ooh, smoking. Well, Congressman Ted Lieu was lying in wait for Ms. Owens and held up a little micro recorder and played this edited clip.
I actually don't have any problems at all with the word nationalism. I think that it gets, the definition gets poisoned by elitists that actually want globalism. The first thing people think about, at least in America, is Hitler. But if Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine. The problem is that he had dreams outside of Germany. He wanted to globalize.
That was her grandfather behind her, by the way. Now, rather than ask her questions, or heck, even challenge her views on the victimology being peddled by liberals to black America, liberal henchman Lieu attacked her character. Now, he doesn't honestly believe that Candace Owens was somehow empathizing with Hitler. Of course he doesn't. But guess what? Owens refused to let the moment pass unchallenged.
What I responded to was that I do not believe that we should be characterizing Hitler as a nationalist. He was a homicidal, psychopathic maniac that killed his own people. A nationalist would not kill their own people. I think it's pretty apparent that Mr. Lieu believes that black people are stupid and will not pursue the full clip in its entirety.
It is not proper to refer disparagingly or to a member of the committee. The witness will not do that again. Witness may continue.
Sure, even though I was called despicable.
Witness may not refer to a member of the committee as stupid.
I didn't refer to him as stupid. That's not what I said. That's not what I said at all. You didn't listen to what I said. May I continue?
Please.
Can you imagine if a liberal African-American woman were treated this way? What they'd do if she were speaking her truth? Feminists across America would be in an all-out revolt. You'd have, like, Samantha Bee would be sputtering about misogyny. Gillibrand and Warren would be leading candlelight vigils across America at campaign rallies. Now, let me be crystal clear here. What's happening is an all-out assault on America's freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of movement. And it's even happening to children who step out of line. Now, last night we brought you the story of an 11-year-old little girl, Bella Moscato, who was called out by her teacher in Long Island for choosing Donald Trump as her hero for a school report. Again, imagine the uproar if some teacher asked some student not to write about Barack Obama as her or his hero. And, of course, media lightweights use the same tactics.
The thing that is so disturbing about what William Barr is doing is, here's yet another person who is trashing their reputation in the name of Donald Trump, another person who, my God, where has he been the past couple of years, will exit the White House sorry that he had trashed his reputation for Donald Trump.
Scarborough questioning Bill Barr? Oh, okay. Well, what Scarborough's implying there is that he and his poisonous panelists will relentlessly malign Bill Barr and anyone else who works for or even supports the administration, for that matter. Now, his words are thinly veiled threats. They're a warning shot across the bow, not just for Barr, but for anyone even thinking of taking a job with the Trump administration. Former DHS Secretary Kristen Nielsen is another target. Yesterday, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted favorably in response to a leftist who wants to punish Nielsen even as she returns to private life. So apparently it wasn't enough to harass people at their homes or in restaurants. Now, far-left activists launch petition drives to prevent these former Trump staffers from earning a living after their government service. Nice. Now, what these activists are saying is this. The price of working for Trump is you are now and forever unclean, an untouchable. My friends, no CEO, no college president, nor any potential employer should ever bow to these types of threats, and that's what they are, is threats. Now, even once reasonable, fairly reasonable Democrats are now supporting this campaign of branding the Trump team with a big scarlet letter, a big T.
She had a background in cybersecurity, but I think that's not what she's going to be known for. And it frankly has to raise the question for anyone who's offered a cabinet opportunity with President Trump, whether their reputation will survive.
He's going to continue to look for people that in many ways are willing to violate their oath of office, which is to enforce the law. And that means that he's going to have a very difficult time finding good people.
Even Leon Panetta, it's unbelievable. But that's the goal, isn't it? The left is uninterested in actually doing things called solving problems. It's moved to 24/7 character assassination of Trump's cabinet, his staff, of course, Trump himself, but really anyone who supports his policies and has the guts to say so. Even little kids like that girl on Long Island. Now, rather than staying, my friends, in a defensive crouch when they threaten and demonize patriotic Americans, we at the Ingraham Angle will continue to expose these tactics, the funding of these organizations underneath all of it, and their ultimate aims. And together, I'm extremely confident tonight that we're going to preserve free and open debate and this country that we all love. And that's the Angle.